For this webinar. This particular discussion is purely on assessment administration. I'll talk about on the next slide, next couple of slides, what exactly we'll be talking about here. Let me pause. We'll go through a couple more chats before I get started. People can hear me, which is great. On the phone and can't hear. Let's see. Zoom disconnecting. Okay, so I would say if you have, I'll talk about this in just a second. If you do have audio or video running, it may help if you disable your video. Just use the audio portion, your own video, so no camera. The camera may slow down your connection or the connection via Zoom. So that's my other recommendation. So with that, I'll proceed. You'll see the slide again in just a second. As I mentioned, turn off Zoom cameras. Make sure that you can preserve your bandwidth as well as that of Zoom. So thank you. Here's our first Menti.com polling question. You should also see this if you're following along on a tablet or a phone. Folks have gotten on there. Are you a state assessment leader? And you don't necessarily have to be the state assessment director. Do you work in the state agency? A district assessment leader, again, in the district office, some kind of a measurement expert, vendor representative, which is fine, or some other thing. And if you want to put in the comments there what your affiliation is, we can certainly look at that via chat. I'll mark that as answered. I don't know how many bubbles we'll have. We have 156 participants. And for those of you who are just joining via phone, we're seeing people so far, about a third of the folks are from districts, about 20% state assessment folks, another quarter measurement experts, vendor representatives, about 6%, 20% for others. So I'd love to hear what some of our other folks are. I can add that to the next time we do this, so we can see them. So we're still populating. Good, so a really, really good mix. In the chat, let us know who some of these other folks are. I'm kind of curious to see who I missed. 20% others. The chat's here. Not everyone has access to the internet, so good. We will be able to discuss this. If you're just via phone, we'll be providing these slides later, and this presentation is not all just visual. So test center managers, that's very important. Again, we oversee teacher certification exams, so we're very experienced with testing centers, school improvement, district assessment. Okay, great. So I'll have this posted via the NCME website at the end of the presentation. Okay. Moving on. As I mentioned, my title is Assistant Deputy Commissioner. I'm in the Division of Accountability Research and Measurement. We'll talk about administering large-scale assessments with fidelity. Some of you who are very experienced, this presentation will talk about some of the folks that have experience. But as we've gone through this, I've been doing large-scale assessment for about 15 years now, been assessment director for about 6. And as we go from year to year, we see folks that are brand new to their position, wherever it is, at the school, district, testing center, or state level, and people don't know where to find all the great resources, or they hear things, they've seen good training resources, but some folks just don't quite know where to find the things and some things they should be thinking about. So I'll talk about this very small piece of large-scale assessment, but also talk about what kind of resources you might want to look at to make sure that you're getting all the best information that you possibly can. Here's our agenda. We'll talk about a general overview for guidance, where to find the information that you should be looking for, and then specific guidance for test administration. And lastly, fall 2020, things to consider for states or districts who want to measure the impact of COVID-19 on learning loss. So some things that we've discussed across states within our state that you all should be thinking about as we do this. That's one more question. Again, for those brand new district assessment leader, thank you. Brand new, just joining in, the Menti.com code 60341 if you want to join via smartphone or tablet. You can do it on a different device, or you can do it on the same screen, splitting screens or going back and forth between the applications. And as again, for those of you who don't have any visuals, we'll be talking through the information and provide the slides later. Another question, are you preparing to administer a fall test to measure the effect of COVID-19? So that could be in some other test that you've already got planned, some new test that you're thinking about administering, or you're just not sure what you're going to do for fall as far as measuring learning loss beyond just summer loss. And if you're in the state of Florida joining us, unsure is probably a good thing to mark. We're still working on options. We're discussing what's out there, what's available, what districts already have. For those of you, as the answers populate, many districts already in Florida already use some kind of interim assessment provided by vendors through contracts they have individually with these providers, these vendors of interim assessments. We know that other states have statewide contracts for formative and interim assessments, benchmarking, or provide, say, through the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium, already provide some interim assessments. So everybody's got different ways to measure things in fall when students come back to school. But if you're doing it purposely for this, there may be some folks that are unsure. So as we get close, looks like folks are finishing up here. 33 folks are unsure. 15 folks say no, and 14 say yes. I think unsure, that's what we've heard within the state and across states, is folks still aren't sure what they want to do about COVID-19. If you're one of the few folks that said yes, are you going to use a statewide assessment, a local assessment? Will it be optional? Will it be required? And an existing or new instrument, or details still TBD? As folks populate there. We'll take a look at some of the questions we're getting. Let it populate a bit more. Someone said they have not seen my hair so long, but I've had 2 haircuts. The Menti code, thank you for sharing. 60341 is the Menti code. My hair may not be so long, it may just be the camera angle, I don't know. A lot of psychometricians have joined us. Okay, and yeah, we call for our assessment leaders, we have district administrative staff. If you're at the district level, you're an assessment leader, okay? So as we get close, for the folks who are in some kind of fall assessment, we have 4 statewide, 7 local fall assessments, 3 optional, 4 required. 11 folks want to use an existing instrument, 2 are considering new instruments, and of course 12 details still TBD. So again, a lot of uncertainty out there, thinking about administering those new assessments, which we'll get to in just a moment. So whether you're thinking about fall or your regular test administrations, quote unquote, or any other use, we have standards. If you aren't familiar, Steve talked about these yesterday. I highly recommend that you get a copy. They're available both in print and digital. The standards for educational and psychological testing, or just the standards. It's a joint product from AERA and APA, the American Psychological Association, and NCME, National Council on Measurement Education, which is why you're here today, I hope. The standards are published collaboratively by the 3 organizations since 1966, and they represent our gold standard in guidance on testing in the US. Frankly, up until just a few years ago, I had heard of them and hadn't really consulted them religiously. I find myself going to them, not the most exciting read in the entire world. You don't have to read it cover to cover. You can look for the topic that you're looking for specific guidance on. There's a very general rule for each of these areas. And under each of the general rules, which I'll talk about in just a moment, there's more specific guidance of exactly what it is that this thing looks like that you're trying to think about. In this case, we'll talk about assessment administration. Regarding those standards, that book, Steve, I didn't have a picture of the cover. If you know this this document, or even if you don't, do you own a copy or use them? Do you own a copy and don't use them? You don't own a copy and you want to, and you don't have them or you don't want them. Hopefully nobody will pick that last one. Art, I'll ask here if you could find the link on the NCMA or Ethan and put the link to where to find the standards. I should have already had that up, my apologies, and paste that into the chat. You can put it into the Zoom chat to make sure that if you don't have a copy, you know where to get them. Our organization, Florida Department of Education, purchased some hardback copies, and it wasn't good enough for me. I wanted the electronic version. I think there's a sale going on the website. You can get a digital version that you can reference from anywhere. Good, so most folks have them and use them. A lot of folks own a copy, don't own a copy and want to, and some own a copy, don't use them. I suggest that you open the book up and you'll see some of the good things that are in the standards that I think you might want to pay attention to. Chat questions. Question about interoperability, QTI standards, the question and test interoperability. That's more of it's not really so much a psychometric or a measurement, that's more of a test administration policy or process answers. I did see an email regarding that. If that's the person asking the question, we can answer that separately. But generally, we don't really talk about QTI standards as kind of the process there. Again, I'll check the chat before I move on. Okay, there. Thanks, Ethan. There's how to get to the standards there. Ethan's pasted that in the chat. And get your own copy of the standards. There's a couple of links there. So thanks to both Art and Ethan for providing that. So getting into this, some of you are familiar with the federal guidelines for peer review, assessment peer review, the requirements that you've got to check all these boxes to make sure that you are, you're doing all the things that the federal government says that you should be doing with testing. And it's not just a check in the box. The standards tell us really what is it that makes a good assessment system? What is it that makes a valid and reliable assessment? And again, this is not just for K-12 statewide assessments. This is for your local assessments. This is for licensure examinations. So standardization is when those testing conditions follow the same detailed procedures for all test takers. Without standardization, the accuracy and comparability of score interpretations is reduced. So it would be reduced. So we'll talk about what all that means and the implications for that in just on the next couple of slides. The variation. So for those of you just listening on the phone, although variations may be made with the intent of maintaining score comparability, the extent to which that is possible cannot often be determined. The comparability of scores may be compromised, and the test may not measure the same construct for all test takers. And this really gets at a question that I asked for years when I first got into this business. I talked to our psychometrician, Dr. Salih Benici is the director of psychometrics in the department. We've worked together for many years. And I remember early on, I would always ask Salih, we wanted to make a change. And I would say, is this much of a change okay? Or can we do this? Something would come up and I'd say, I'd like to adjust something because we need a little bit longer window. I want to reduce testing for things. How much, can we do this and still have the same test? And his answer, what the standard will tell us, it depends. It's hard to know. I'll talk about some good examples here. It's impossible to know how much of a change is going to impact how much an impact that has on the measurement, where the measurement is no longer really a measurement of what the student knows and can do, and how much of it is measurement of your change in the test administration environment. So the idea is as specific as you can be, or as consistent as you could be in the standardized assessment administration, the better it is for your results, the more defensible the results. That's not to say that you don't have to have some variability for other reasons, one of them being accommodations, just one example. So if you have flexibility in administration, timing, presentation, or supports, that's appropriate so that all test takers, especially those with disabilities, have access to the test content. You want to take care so that the variations don't fundamentally alter the construct being measured. Judgments regarding the suitability of such adjustments have to be made by qualified individuals, and they need to be consistent with the guidelines set forth by the test, the publishers and the users. I'll give you an example, the read aloud. For so long, read aloud, at least in my time in large scale assessment, read aloud of the reading test was absolutely forbidden because it was a different thing from having, it's not a listening test, it's a reading test. Then we started to have some questions around, what are you really assessing a student's ability to read, or are you assessing the student's comprehension? And if you're really assessing the student's comprehension, whether that student reads the passage or has the passage read to them, you may be measuring that comprehension in the same way. So you're able to address the student's need for an accommodation, but you're not changing the construct because you're measuring the student's comprehension, whether they read the text or not. However, if it's phonemic awareness, the ability to recognize words that create certain blends, then having that read to them again, that violates that construct of what you're measuring. So you've got to know that the variation depends on what the construct is and what degree to which that you're changing this, or you're not changing the construct of what you're measuring. Another variation another case study in variation. In our research for the state of Florida, and also in looking back for this, thinking about test administration, looked across lots and lots of states. Won't name these states, they're just put letters here. Say state A administers statewide tests. There are states that do this. They say every subject must be given on the same day, statewide, and all sessions strictly timed. There are a few states that do that just to make sure that, again, adhering to that standardization. There are other states, and state B is an example, that allow districts to administer tests as each see fit anytime over a 5-week window. All the sessions are strictly timed, however. So you've got this, part of the school year that's set aside for testing, but all the sessions are strictly timed. This was a surprise to me, but I found a state, we'll call this state C, that allows districts to administer tests as each sees fit in the district at any point over a given multi-week window, including the option for flexible timing, including the district option to administer tests in a given subject in either 1 or 2 days. So it's up to you whenever you want to give the test. District, you tell you want to give the test over 1 day, that's fine. You want to give it over 2 days, that's fine. Timing is all up to you. If you want to set some time limits for the school day, great. If not, you can let schools and students figure it out for themselves. Now the poll question. So the test, I say state or district, state, district, or testing program, if you're a test center supervisor, would you say that you're more like state A, where you're very strict? Would you say that you're more like state B with some flexibility? Would you say you're more like state C, where you're very flexible? Yeah. Okay. So as people are populating now, I'll hover over and see if we have more chat questions as people answer. We have an FYI. NCME is going to release an items module on accessibility for educational assessments by Leanne Geller and colleagues this week. It's in its introductory. So it talks about accessibility for educational assessments. I'm sure we'll talk about assessment administration and standardization there. I have a question about whether the module will address QTI, that standards data question again. Okay, so we see here for most responses, again, for those of you who aren't watching on a screen, we have 10 responses that say administrations are very strict, 26 responses that say there's some flexibility, and 16 that say that it's very, very flexible. Okay, so again, every state has, I'd say Florida is more like state B, where we try to provide as much guidance as we can. We try to be as state A-like as possible. But understanding one of the big challenges is technology, where if there's not a one-to-one in a school or district, there's not a one-to-one technology ability, it makes it much more difficult to have all those tests administered in a very short window. So we've got that flexibility. So again, back to that question, how much flexibility is too flexible? Well, we can't really know that. We can't really know that, and we'll talk about this. The impact is difficult to quantify or even qualify, and in most cases, it's just unknowable to what extent we've changed the construct. There's some questions I have posed. So for example, in a very flexible 5-week window, do students that take the test in week 5 of a 5-week window perform better than those who tested in week 1? A question you'd say, how much more instruction did the week 5 students receive than those week 1 students? You basically took away a month of instruction. Did districts or schools make the decision to put the students who are struggling, let them test at the back end of the window? So you let all your most able students test at the early part of the window when they say they choose to get it out of the way. It's hard to know because without knowing exactly what districts and schools did, these changes may have been masked. Any differences may be masked. You'd say, well, we looked at it and there was no difference in performance. Well, was that because the students testing later had more instruction but were less able to start? The students that were more able tested early would have done well anyway. You can't know that. Did students taking the test over 2 days perform better than those testing in 1 day? Similar to the week-long issue, there may be a decision to have students who need more time, give them the test over 2 days. You may think that improves their score, and maybe not. Where students who don't need that extra time are going to test all in 1 day because they think they perform better anyway. Again, it's hard to measure the difference in those administrations, just things that you need to think about as a district or a state or someone who's over a testing center, for instance. So we talked about some generalities there. So what do the standards say? What do we have to think about when we talk about test administration? Some of the things we need to attend to. The standards document is broken up into 4 major sections for these topics, and so each of these sections there's a broad, bold heading that says changes or disruptions to test administration. And there's considerations underneath. And then the next section talks about testing environment, appropriate instructions, practice, and support. And the 4th section talks about maintaining test security and integrity. Again, for you experienced test administrators, this may not be news. This may not be news to you. There may be some aspects that you haven't thought about or that you haven't attended to. And the standards give you some meat, some ideas about how to attend to those things. So the first topic, the changes or disruptions to test administration procedures. In the standards document itself, it doesn't talk about every instance of what can happen. It just talks about generally. It could be brief, it could be just local, it could be longer term, could be widespread or somewhere in between. The standards don't provide examples. I offer some here where there's a fire alarm that's a very local, it's not real fire, stops the testing experience, whether it's on paper or computer, disrupts the classroom a little bit, students come back in and begin testing. Then a big technology disruption, say there's a statewide outage or the vendor has a problem, as many of us have experienced, or some kind of natural or man-made disaster during the testing window that disrupts things. No matter the purpose, no matter the reason for the disruption, you need to document and report to the test users and owners. So why do I say reported to the test users and owners? You may not know, or the folks who own the test or who help administer the test may not know of your local issues. It's really important for you to let them know that this thing happened so you can document it. In case there's something that the results come back, you don't think it's an issue or you think it's a localized issue, you want to make sure that you have that documented. So if there's a question about the results later or this becomes more widespread than thought, you've got this documentation to go back and you help yourself and you help the publishers figure out what the issue is so that you can make sure that the results are what you hope they are. And if there was some issue, you have a reason why and you have some motivation, some logical reason to treat the scores differently in that reason, for that reason. So those implications for interruption test scores, for example, in Florida, we had some issues and just a few issues. My folks in Florida know there was a little bit more than a few issues. All the documentation that we got from districts and schools helped us track down the extent and the level of disruption, and we're able to see was it as bad as people thought? Was it worse? Were there some things that we need to think about? And we made some statewide policy decisions that couldn't have been made otherwise without the documentation that we got from the folks in the districts and the schools to help us move forward. The other thing, testing environment, these all seem very easy to think about. These are all included in the standards. There's the last bullet that I wanted to bring out for everybody to think about. Of course, you want adequate lighting, you want the quiet environment, and obviously temperature control. It may be too hot or too cold for some people, but you need some means by which to control it. Material, print's not too small, whatever device that folks are on, that they're able to read it. Adequate room, including room for folks proctors to monitor the test, as well as to assist test takers without disrupting other test takers. And of course, stable internet connectivity and functional devices for those needing computer-based testing. One really important point here is you want to make sure that those testing conditions are consistent with those what's expected by the test publisher, the test user, and also prevalent when norms and interpretive data were gathered. This is one of the reasons why whenever we change tests, you could think about a test program that's 10 or 15 years old. The devices or the conditions under which those norms or the data were gathered may change over the years. And you might think when it's time to revise your tests, thinking about the conditions that, as a computer-based test, what are the devices like? Think about the things that have happened over time to change the way that the test might be administered. But you want to make sure the testing environment is the same as it was when the norms were gathered. And if you think things need to change, that's something to think about, a different kind of standard setting or a different assessment system if you're going to have extremely different test administration conditions moving forward. Always appropriate instructions, practice, and support. I'll give another vignette on what happened in Florida. Obviously, students need clear instructions on how to mark responses. Detailed guidance on the software functionality that's not familiar to test takers. If there's some tool or something external to the test that students need, make sure that they're familiar with it. Practice for test takers to be able to respond to specific or unique item types, and monitoring to make sure that test takers are interacting with item types as intended. So there's practice, but you need to make sure that they're doing it correctly. So it's practice makes perfect, but it's actually perfect practice makes perfect, and to make sure that they know how to, students know how to interact with the items. And then guidance for test takers regarding item scoring, time limits to help test takers determine pacing, and then scoring rules for guessing and finishing. So you tell students to leave answers blank. Do you tell them to answer every question? It helps them to know how many points a question's worth if they're raw points, so they know how to interact with it, and how it's scored, so they know how to interact it. All those kinds of things are important to provide in advance. I'll give you an example. For years, we gave our alternate assessment. It's a paper delivered assessment where test administrators would mark their answers on paper. Those paper responses would be packaged, shipped, and scored back to the vendor to be scanned and scored. Eventually, the alternate assessment system changed to where students still take a paper-based test, but test administrators or teachers input their responses into a computer-based system that is then scored electronically, remotely. So instead of shipping things in, they enter their responses online. The alternate assessment is a scaffolded assessment where a student's response to one part changes the way that, or affects whether they're presented with another item or an additional item or a different level of a task. So again, so it's really important that the test is administered in this certain way that is scored appropriately. After the first year of having the paper-based test that was entered on computer, it became evident that there was something in the instructions that had happened for years where test administrators may have been misadministering the assessment. Now, again, we don't know exactly what happened there, but we only knew based on this new assessment administration that there may have been an administration issue. So that led to additional guidance. It wasn't so much that folks weren't reading the instructions. We said, what can we do to make the instructions better, clearer, so that there are fewer test administration issues? And we managed in the following years, updated those test administration policies to make for better test fewer issues with test administration. And of course, test security integrity, taking steps to detect, prevent, and respond to test taker efforts to obtain scores by fraudulent means. Seating charts, positive test taker identification, appropriate spacing between test takers, implementation of policies that prohibit electronic devices or unapproved research material, use of erasure analyses or similarity indices to determine anomalous response patterns, whether similar response among groups or pairs of students, so forth, and policies to maintain the control of and access to secure test materials. Again, things that seem reasonable and logical, they're all laid out there for you in the standards. And again, for those of you who are new or haven't refreshed yourselves on these kinds of things, the standards are a good place to start or go back to. Finally, we get into the discussion about fall test administration. Again, so basically you take all the things that we've talked about previously, those 4 big buckets, the standards and so forth, and then apply all those things to fall. But as we looked at thinking about fall assessment, especially when you don't normally give a certain instrument or you don't give fall assessments at all, you really want to pay attention to some of the most important pieces. So here's our first question. Are you considering at-home fall testing? Okay, as it's populating, we'll let folks answer. I got a lot of responses here. I'll look at the chats as people answer their questions. Have a comment here. Found that schools trying to wait until the end of the window to test the struggling students end up with students not completing multi-session tests due to attendance issues. That's a tough balance for sure. And yes, we see that in Florida all the time, getting students to come back. It's very, very true. Study on the importance of air conditioning. That's very, very good. Kara Jackson provided a link to the importance of air conditioning. I will read that. We'll also have the chats, the links in the chats will also be provided. So let's see, considering at-home testing, we have 15 yes responses. We have 10 no, 6 heck no, and 16 unsure responses. Folks that are unsure if they're going to give at-home tests. I don't go into that in this presentation, but I've got a little bit of time, so I'll talk a little about, we had a really great presentation from several folks. Those of us who are CCSSO, the Chief Counsel of State School Officer, there's a collaborative called Technical Issues in Large Scale Student Assessment. And we had several presentations that talked about at-home testing and things to consider. There was something really great. Joe Martineau, who's an expert in assessment, now works for ETS. He presented talking about some of the things to think about, and something he said really struck me, that fall at-home testing really should be considered an entirely different mode of testing. It's not just another computer-based testing. It's a different mode of testing altogether. If you think about the environment, the instructions, the student interaction, what the student's thinking about, where the parents are, what are they thinking about the interactions there. So it's an entirely different thought of testing. We also saw a presentation from a vendor that had allowed some large-scale spring at-home testing with their online platform, and the expected comparisons between fall and winter scores and spring scores on their own tests really were as expected in a normal year, say for fall of 18 and winter of 18 to spring of 19 in their own assessment. You saw the correlation, student performance was as expected. But that same provider giving those tests in a regular environment, quote unquote, in the fall of 18, winter of 18, 19, and then those same tests being given in an at-home environment really created some very unexpected results. So again, unexpected from a measurement expected, but if you think about the at-home thing, it's a difference. It was a big difference. And then you think about, AP at-home testing. what College Board did is to be applauded in such a short time. They may have been thinking about at-home testing. What they did to launch that was absolutely amazing. Hats off to them to get that done. But again, as we know, the AP at-home tests were a little bit different. For our purposes, a K-12 large-scale statewide assessment, you're thinking about, you're trying to measure learning loss from one year to the next, and you're also thinking about growth to the following year. So spring 21 assessments given in the usual way. You have this different mode of testing, at-home testing. What does that administration do to the comparability from prior assessment scores to these at-home assessment scores to future assessment scores? You've got to think about those administration challenges and changes as you consider at-home fall testing. I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of analyses, presentations, and I hope that there's a lot of guidance out there to help the folks that are going to do it for whatever reason, to help do it with as much fidelity as possible. Again, none of these bullets is anything that we didn't cover previously, but I think some of these are more important to attend to. So I'd say that we want to make sure that we ensure that districts and schools and whoever the at-home audience, that they're all provided the necessary training, the resources, and test administration guidance. You want to make sure that you schedule the time for school training on test administration or the testing center, test administration and security. Time to recruit your proctors. If you haven't done this before, you've got to make sure that you've got to find folks to administer these assessments, train them, and make sure that they understand how to give these assessments. Making sure that you've got computer-based tests, you've got your readiness, including the preparations for any new release of software, browsers, and updates. Again, unless you're used to giving tests very close to the beginning of the school year, sometimes contractors have new software updates. You've got new device supports, new operating systems and so forth. Are those changes going to be rolled out and in place in time for you to provide these new computer-based assessments? Again, if you're giving an assessment that you've never given before, make sure that you've got access to those sample practice test materials so that students are familiar with the computer-based tests. They probably not giving paper-based tests, but making sure they're familiar with those computer-based tests. I want to make sure that, go to the next slide here. Yeah, make sure that you've got the guidance on test length and your number of test days. Are you going to let them test over one day, over 2 days, or is it going to be 1 day? Making sure, timing, makeup days. Are you going to provide for makeup days? During the very near the start of the school year, we know a lot of districts spend months and months and months training their schools, their test administrators to be sure that they're ready to give these tests with fidelity. And here you may be doing this on a very, very short timeline. I think a really important here, this was actually put forth by Susie Lee, our Bureau Chief in K-12 Student Assessment, who provided all these bullets, and I incorporated them and added a few others. But treating the fall pre-testing event, especially if you're giving it on the authority of the district or the state or the agency, you want to make sure that you treat a pre-testing event the same as you do any other test administration, to make sure that students have the same fair testing experience. If you say, well, this is just, we're doing this, there's no stakes associated, we're just doing this to measure COVID learning loss, it's okay if you take some shortcuts here and there. If you as the owner of the test send that message for these tests, you've got to think it might have the impact of being carried over into future test administrations. A state like Florida, we have other fall tests, retake opportunities for tests that for graduation purposes. You don't want to have any of that bleed over saying, well, we were loose and fancy free with some of these rules, so we may be loose and fancy free with some of these other rules. So make sure that you treat those events the same as you do for any other usage. So here's an opportunity for you to type in with respect to test administration only. What are your biggest concerns for in-school fall testing? So again, we talked about at-home testing. This is just for in-school. So you can type as little or as much as you like, and the responses should populate if we get any. And while we wait for folks to type any responses or comments, question here is, let's see if we see any, make sure we're open this up. Does the day of the week that a test is administered on, especially Mondays and Fridays, have any impact on performance? I think, again, at least in the state of Florida, we see across the entire state that we see this pattern where Mondays we see some tests given, not a lot. Then we see a spike as Tuesday, Wednesday's a heavy test day. Thursday, it falls off from Wednesday, and generally Fridays we see testing drop off greatly. That has a big change. So you have a raised hand, one second, I'll get to that in a moment. We see people have concerns about whether student attendance, if there's an attendance issue, students may seem to miss Fridays or Mondays. You want to test most of the kids when you think you can get them there. And again, does it have impact on performance? I'm sure it depends on what time of the year, what else is going on around that time, what are the district policies. So it may have an impact on performance, but again, I think it's localized. Can anyone name the movie? Oh, for our All Is Well, Kevin Bacon, Animal House, for those of you who don't know. Let's see, we've got some, there may be some issue with people being able to provide responses, and maybe that's what the raised hand is about. Okay. Yep. Animal House is our movie. Okay. So again, I think if you were asking me this question, I would go back to those slides. The test administration it's something that if you haven't done anything, if you haven't done it before, here we are, we're in June. If you're thinking about giving these tests, August is not that far away, or September, depending on what state you're in. For fall K-12 testing, how to do that and to get the information out to schools and districts. That would be, one concern. As I mentioned, getting all the things in place, technology infrastructure, not to mention contracts, but get the training together to make sure that that you're ready to be up and running. And then stakes, I think one thing that would keep me up, we talked about not treating the test any differently, but I think it does. The stakes of the assessment affect how with what fidelity it's administered, how seriously students take it. But again, I don't think you want stakes with this test. You really want to know what students have lost over the summer and with the COVID learning loss. So you don't want to tie accountability, student or school or teacher or otherwise. You just want to know where students are. But that will have some impact on how the test is perceived. Oh, for some, voting is closed, so I apologize for that. And I'm not sure why. So if we want to just type in, if there are comments, you can just type those into the chat. So my apologies for that. Apparently user error for closing that voting, and I can't figure out how to open it. Okay. There we go. There you go, C. Just a matter of C of closing and opening. That was it. But I'll respond to the question about will all students return to school. I can speak for Florida and what we've heard. A fairly prevalent concern will be logistics around maintaining appropriate distance during testing. That's a really good point. And the change to exposure risk that comes from keeping a large group of students in a single location for an extended period of time. Yeah, that's a really, really, really good point. We've had some discussions already. We are waiting for guidance. There's CDC guidance out already. We think the state of Florida will be issuing guidance soon about distancing between students. If you think about taking cafeterias, if you don't want students eating together, do you convert that cafeteria space into some kind of testing space. Same thing with gymnasiums. Students may need to have places to run inside and so forth, whether it's 3 through 5, 6, 8, or 9, 12 schools, but is that space better used to allow more distance between students? We know that we've already spoken. We have I mentioned our fall regular testing, our retake testing. We think we're going to expand the window to accommodate those folks that are not able to test all the students at once, to make sure that we have that. So yeah, so now people are getting in, so I appreciate that. Yes, extended authentic student responses. Again, I think that goes with this comment here, lack of student engagement. I do think that again, without motivation, with all these students have been out of school since mid-March, if not longer. Will they care? We come back and we can say that this is a no stakes assessment and why we're giving it, but will the student care? Will they say, here I am back at school, the first thing you're doing is giving me a test? So I think motivation will be a concern. Sanitization between sessions, that's great. Social distancing, definitely a concern. Potential lingering fears over COVID-19, that's a good point, especially with no vaccine on the horizon. Equity, I think that's equity is a concern, especially for at-home testing, but in school fall testing. I think the learning loss will show with the students that have been engaged versus not, and I think we do see a socioeconomic difference between engagement over this period. Again, I see safety is a big concern. Back in the groove, I think that's a really good piece. Again, I think if students don't perform well, that's to be expected, but we would like to know they're not in the groove to take the test, but I think that'll all show in the data that we see there. And I can press enter to pause scrolling. Handling paper materials. For those of you who have paper materials, test administration manuals or pencils or anything else, I think that's important. How do we make sure that that we test safely? A great point. How many teachers will not be returning? I think also along with that, how many students don't return? We know that I'm sure there will be teachers that for all kinds of valid and appropriate reasons don't want to come back. Similarly, students may be themselves very healthy. There may be no concern, but maybe there's a parent or a grandparent at the house that they're worried about the test administration, because they just won't show. So you won't be able to administer it at the same time to the same kids, and kids come in with different concerns. The validity of scores given the change in environment, I think that brings up a really good point. We're going to have to put, no matter with how much fidelity that we give these fall assessments, we have to say that this administration looks really, really different than what what we've seen previously, even with a regular fall administration, even if you give fall tests regularly. Here's a good, if I can pause the scrolling here. Yeah, here's a great, I didn't realize I could pop this out here. Ensuring best practices and process in a short window for preparation. Ensuring the assessments provide the needed information on learning loss as actionable data teachers can use immediately to provide intervention. I will say I've seen some things from some of the vendors that are talking about what they expect, and I think this is easier for mathematics. Coming into grade 4, for example, what kind of prerequisite skills that the third grade students didn't get that we can focus on, and what will this data that we get tell us about what students are doing, or where we need to focus the teacher efforts based on what we see from that data. Back to school, making sure that I'm trying to hit all the ones that we haven't talked about yet. This is a great one. I've already heard this one from a couple of Florida districts. Many, I think almost all district devices in some districts, if not all districts, are home with students. What do you do if those devices don't come back, or don't come back in a way that's serviceable? What do you do for administrations? Do you go back to sharing devices? And then there's also the safety concerns there making sure that devices are clean. And if you don't have one device per student, what do you do about that? Great point. Yes, will students be ready to take a test? Again, I think for the purposes that we might administer a fall test, that's exactly, we're measuring how unready they are for the start of the school year. So I think that may be less of a concern, but how will our teachers, staff be, ready to administer the test? Again, I think just the idea of an assessment, no matter how you couch it, they won't be willing to sit down to do their best, or be unwilling, motivated to sit down and take an assessment. So I think as we scroll through these, again, we have some time, we do have the ability to export all of these comments and concerns. I think these are great questions for you to talk about within your own areas, and to be ready for as you think about these things. Let's see, health of staff, exactly right. I definitely get that. Okay, let me jump in. There's a couple of other comments, and there's one here. That's a great idea. Will test manuals be updated so test tickets and pencils, et cetera, are not passed from test administrator to tester? We've seen, if you've been out and about, most places have places with pens. There's a cup with sanitized pens, and after you sign with a pen, you put it in the unsanitized. Do you do those same kinds of things for utensils that if you're using Scantron sheets and so forth, minimizing the amount of things that you have to pass back and forth between people? So that's a good point there. Close this out. Let's see. Yeah, logistical constraints for folks that are who proctor the assessments. Okay. Jump into the chat. We're getting close to time, so we saw that content coverage and comparability across modes. I think that's a good piece. When you pick your instrument, you want to make sure that you're administering an instrument that measures all the things that you intend to measure. And if you're having to give things differently, again, we talked about in-home versus or at-home versus in-school assessments. I think you don't want to make any kind of comparability claims on those kinds of assessments. Again, for the answer to these presentations and comments will be shared. Again, we'll have a recording. I will make sure that this Mentimeter, I'll get a PDF file that has all of these great questions. I think we could make an entire new presentation on fall testing based on just the things that you guys have all shared. You'll see those. You'll have this recording as well to view it. Again, a Mentimeter slides and then the recording of the webinar as well. Okay. Great question. Are we aware of any recent studies that compare student performance on remote testing to that of on-site testing? Again, so I think I won't name our vendor that was so kind to share the information. We've seen some data of remote testing versus at home or versus on-site testing that does raise some questions. Now, then the other question becomes, what can you do about the test administration to mitigate those changes? Is there anything that you can change? As I think about statewide assessments, we could say, well, we could have an AP at home, change our tests to be not so, reduce the opportunity for cheating. We could change our tests to do that if we thought have stricter time limits and so forth. But anything that we do to change the test to try to address the at-home testing concerns then changes the construct, then makes it hard to make the comparisons or measure the kind of changes, the growth, the losses, and so forth. So anything that you do to make your test kind of at-home test cheat-proof changes the construct, changes the comparability, the longitudinal analysis. So I think depending on what the College Board has planned regarding AP test performance, telemetry, how quickly the students upload, the 1% that you probably have read in the media about having issues. What does that look like? You know, what kind of guidance do they have for other folks thinking about at-home testing? Those are all things I'd love. I hope the College Board will be able to share with us. Another question here. Oh, I've already answered that one. Parent support. Do you want your, you know, will they see the value of having students come back to do, you know, to take these tests? Will they encourage their students to do their best? Okay. As we get close to time, I would like to thank everybody for sharing your time with us, sharing your thoughts. Again, these are great comments. I'm glad I figured out a way to unlock the comment section. I will go back through these. We'll answer some for the group that, in case I missed any. I think we see a lot of the same themes that we've covered already. And again, I will be using some of these things as we think about our own testing, not just for this fall, but administering tests in the coming spring as well. So again, we'll provide recordings. Ethan can help us figure out how to share those. With that, let's see, I think we have one more question. Yes, we will make sure that these comments, again, it's the wisdom of crowds. This is a very wise crowd. We will get all of these comments because they are fantastic. Okay. Everyone, I'd like to thank you. Join us. The last thing I'd like to say is, and I'm going to read from the script there because I prepared it. I want to make sure I give Art his due. Tomorrow, you're going to hear from Dr. Art Thacker. He's been a principal scientist at Humro since 1997. He'll talk about the end product of what we're creating when we administer the test, which is, of course, the scores. He'll discuss what it means to have a valid, reliable, fair, and accurate test result, the considerations for the uses and the misuses of subscores, which we all know about. And one of the areas of importance that he'll address is the use and the misuse, the subscore data and the challenge for state and local education agencies around COVID-19. Art will help us think about the challenges in looking at assessment data that you may be gathering this fall and that states will gather next spring. So I think we've given Art lots of food for thought for his presentation tomorrow. I know I will be there. Hopefully you all will be as well. And again, we'll provide these recordings shared. And Ethan will make sure that we get these out on the NCME site posted, and I will make sure that I share it appropriately with everybody. Okay. Thank you all, and have a great day.